There is a tablet in the British Museum's storerooms that has been catalogued 3 separate times, under 3 different names, in 3 different centuries. In 1849, a British archaeologist named Austen Henry Layard was tearing through the mound of Kuyunjik on the east bank of the Tigris, opposite the modern city of Mosul. He didn't know it yet, but he had found the buried library of an Assyrian king, Ashurbanipal, the last great ruler of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, a man so obsessed with knowledge that he'd sent scribes across his entire kingdom with a single standing order: copy everything. Every incantation, every omen, every medical text, every myth, every king list, every letter a priest had ever written to a nervous ruler about a bad dream, copy it and send it to Nineveh. That library is real. It is, still, one of the single greatest archives of the ancient world. Over 30,000 clay fragments, most of them now sitting in drawers in London, still being read, still being translated. Nearly 200 years later, we are, right now, in the middle of a project that has outlived every person who started it. Somewhere in that mountain of fragments is a tablet that doesn't quite fit. It's catalogued. We'll use the working designation K.9204, following the museum's real K prefix for the Kuyunjik collection, as part of a genuine, well-documented incantation series called the Utuku Lemnutu, which translates roughly to the evil demons. This series is real. It's one of the best preserved ritual text collections we have from ancient Mesopotamia, and for over a century, scholars have used it to reconstruct how the people of Sumer and Akkad understood illness, misfortune, and the things that walk at night. Most of the Utuku Lemnutu reads exactly the way you'd expect a demon-banishing manual to read: repetitive, formulaic, instructions for a priest: burn this herb, recite this line 3 times, tie this knot. K.9204 doesn't read like that. It reads like a checklist: 9 sections, 9 numbered conditions, no ritual instructions attached to most of them, just a description, almost clinical in its precision, of 9 specific ways a person can start behaving when something the text calls a word we'll come back to, a word that means something close to breath or life force, has been partially taken from them by something else. Not killed, not possessed exactly, diminished, as if a portion of what makes a person a whole, continuous self has been quietly borrowed and not given back. The translator who first worked through this fragment in detail, we'll call him by his working name for this video, since large parts of his personal notes remain unpublished and disputed, got through 8 of the 9 sections before he stopped. He never published the 9th. In a private letter, later recovered from an estate sale and now sitting, uncatalogued, in a private collection, he wrote a single line explaining why a man should not go looking for the names of what took him. We're going to spend the next 3 hours with this tablet. We're going to go through all 9 conditions, one at a time, in the order the original text lists them. And before we go any further, I want to say one thing directly, in my own voice, because I think you deserve it, before the story starts pulling you along. Everything you're about to hear is a piece of history and a thought experiment. It is not a diagnosis. If any of these 9 things sound like you, and I'd be a little surprised if, 3 hours from now, at least one of them doesn't, the first and best place to take that feeling is a doctor or a therapist. Not a 5,000-year-old tablet, not this video. I mean that. Keep it in your back pocket. We're going to have some fun being unsettled together. That's what you're here for. But I'm not going to let this video be the kind of content that tells you your real feelings are a mystery no one can explain. They're not a mystery. People have explained them. We're going to explain them too, right alongside the old story, the whole way through. Okay, 9 symptoms, 1 tablet, a man who buried the 9th page. Let's go find out what he found. If you're the kind of person who likes sitting with the uncomfortable stuff instead of scrolling past it, subscribe, get comfortable, and settle in. This one's long, and it's supposed to be. One more thing, while we're still in the dark, I said this tablet doesn't fit the pattern of the rest of the series it was catalogued under, and I want you to actually understand what that means, because doesn't fit is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and I don't want to hand it to you for free. The Utuku Lemnutu series, across its genuine, well-documented tablets, follows a consistent internal logic. Name the demon, describe the affliction it causes in broad strokes, then move immediately into the ritual response. The herbs, the knots, the words spoken over water. It's a working manual. It reads like one. Priest opens it, finds the relevant demon, performs the relevant fix, patient goes home. That's the genre. That's what every other tablet in this collection is for. K. 9204 spends the vast majority of its surface describing symptoms in obsessive, specific, almost novelistic detail, and only gestures at treatment in a handful of lines, right at the very end, almost as an afterthought. If you didn't know better, you'd think whoever wrote this wasn't trying to help a priest treat a patient. You'd think they were trying to make sure somebody, someday, could read this and recognize themselves in it. That's the shape of the thing we're about to spend 3 hours inside. Not a spellbook, a description. Let's go find out who it was written for. Chapter 1. The Two Men Who Treated You in Sumer. Before we can understand what K-Bont 9204 is claiming, we have to understand something true, something real, something that most people, even people who love ancient history, have never been taught in school. Because it turns out the ancient Mesopotamians had a more sophisticated model of illness than most people assume, and it's one that, in a strange way, our own medical system is still catching up to. If you got sick in Sumer, or later in Babylon or Assyria, you didn't have one kind of doctor available to you. You had two, and they were not rivals. They were not competing schools of thought, the way a modern skeptic and a modern faith healer might be. They were, formally, two halves of the same medical system, and a single sick person could, and often did, see both of them in the same week for the same illness. The first was called the Asu. Think of the Asu as the physician. This was a person trained in what we would recognize immediately as practical medicine, herbal remedies, poultices, diet, wound care, surgery when necessary. Cuneiform medical texts, and we have hundreds of them, record Asu-style prescriptions with the same structure a modern pharmacology text would use: symptom, ingredient, preparation, dosage, application. Crushed juniper for this. A poultice of date paste and oil for that. If you had a fever, a wound, a stomach ailment, the Asu is who you wanted at your bedside, and the Asu's toolkit, when you actually read it, looks less like magic and more like an early, empirical pharmacy, built from centuries of trial, error, and careful record-keeping by people paying close attention to what worked. The second was called the Ashipu. This is the harder role to translate cleanly into a modern word, and most scholars land somewhere around exorcist priest or diagnostic specialist because neither quite covers it. The Ashipu's domain was the causes of illness that the Asu's herbs couldn't reach, what we might now call the psychological, the behavioral, the relational, the things that don't show up as a wound or a fever but absolutely show up as a person no longer being fully present in their own life. The Ashipu was trained not to look at a rash or a broken bone, but to observe a person's behavior, how they spoke, how they responded to their own name, whether their eyes tracked normally, whether their affect matched the situation they were in. It was, in the truest sense, a diagnostic discipline built entirely around close behavioral observation, arguably the ancient world's closest analog to what a modern clinician does in a psychiatric intake interview. And crucially, this is the detail that should stop you for a second. The Mesopotamians did not treat physical and spiritual as a hard binary, the way a lot of modern folk history assumes ancient people did. Illness could have a natural cause and a supernatural cause at the same time, layered, and a good outcome usually meant treating both. This wasn't confusion. It was closer to a working model of illness that had room for more than one kind of explanation, without those explanations cancelling each other out. Now, the concept at the center of the Ashipu's diagnostic work is the word I mentioned in the cold open, Z. Z is genuinely one of the oldest words we can reconstruct in Sumerian, and it's layered in a way that's hard to translate with a single English word. At its most basic, it means breath, the literal air moving in and out of a living body, but it expands outward from there to mean something closer to life force, vitality, the animating thing that separates a living person from a corpse. In later Akkadian texts, a related and overlapping concept appears under the word napishtu, again meaning something like life, but with a strong secondary sense tied to the throat, the breath, the literal windpipe through which life enters and leaves a body. When Akkadian scribes wanted to write to kill, one of the idioms they used was, quite literally, to cut the napishtu. So, breath, throat, life, vitality, all braided into one concept in a culture that clearly understood, on some level, that whatever makes a person fully present is fragile, located somewhere in the body, and can be diminished without the body itself dying. This is the conceptual foundation K.9204 is built on. Not possession in the horror movie sense of a foreign entity fully overwriting a person. Something quieter and, honestly, stranger. A partial taking. A person who is still walking around, still breathing, still recognizably themselves to everyone but perhaps to themselves, but who is, in some specific and describable way, not entirely there. And the fragment doesn't invent this idea out of nowhere. It's drawing on a genuinely rich, well-documented catalogue of beings the Mesopotamians believed were responsible for exactly this kind of partial taking. Let's meet them, because you'll see these names again as we move through the 9 symptoms. The Utuku were a broad category of spirit, not inherently evil originally, though the Utuku Lemnutu series is specifically concerned with the malevolent ones. Think of Utuku as roughly analogous to spirit as a category, the way English uses ghost to cover a wide range of specific folkloric beings. The Galu were considered among the most dangerous, often described as demons of the underworld, servants of the goddess Ereshkigal, sent up specifically to drag the dead, or the not quite dead enough, back down with them. The Ekimu are, in some ways, the most emotionally resonant of the group to a modern reader. Restless dead, ghosts, essentially, in the most literal sense, the spirits of people who died without proper burial rites, or who died with grievances unresolved, wandering because the normal process of moving on had been interrupted. Mesopotamian funerary practice put enormous weight on correct burial precisely because an improperly buried person was believed to become exactly this kind of restless, potentially dangerous presence. Lamashtu was a specific, named demoness, genuinely one of the most vivid figures in the entire Mesopotamian demonic catalogue, associated primarily with threats to infants and mothers during childbirth. She appears constantly in protective amulets that have survived to this day, usually shown being driven off by the god Pazuzu, which, yes, is a real, documented figure, and yes, that name should sound familiar, for reasons that have nothing to do with this video and everything to do with 1973. And then there are the Lilu and Lilitu, night-wandering spirits, male and female respectively, associated with darkness, sleep, and the vulnerable liminal state of a person who is neither fully awake nor fully asleep. We're going to spend real time with this one later, because it connects to something genuinely universal in human experience that shows up, with startling consistency, in folklore from cultures that never had any contact with each other. So that's the world K.9204 is operating inside. Not an isolated superstition, a fully worked-out cosmology, with named categories of threat, a professional class trained to diagnose them, and a companion professional class trained to treat the purely physical alongside it. What made the Ashipu's diagnostic method distinct, and this is the piece that sets up everything we're about to spend 2 hours on, is that the Ashipu was not trained to look for wounds, fevers, or visible injury. The Ashipu was trained to watch a person's against a baseline of what that person's presence normally looked like, and to notice specific, describable deviations, a delay in responding to their own name, a mismatch between expressed emotion and felt emotion, an unfamiliarity with their own reflection, a hollowing out of ordinary pleasure. Each category of spirit was believed to leave a distinct behavioral signature, the way, and I'll draw this comparison once because I think it's fair, and then leave it alone. A modern clinician might recognize a cluster of symptoms as one diagnosis rather than another, based on pattern. That's the structure K.9204 borrows. 9 symptoms, 9 signatures, presented, if the fragment is genuine, as the Ashipu's working diagnostic checklist for exactly this kind of partial taking. I want to spend a few more minutes here, before we move on, because there's a piece of this professional distinction that I think gets lost every time this topic comes up in popular history, and it's worth getting right. The Asu and the Ashipu weren't ranked. There's no surviving evidence of one profession looking down on the other, no hierarchy where the real doctor tolerated the priest as a superstitious sideshow, royal correspondence that survives from the Neo-Assyrian court, genuine letters sent to real kings, some of them frantic with worry over a sick child or a troubling omen, shows both kinds of practitioner being summoned, sometimes in the same letter, sometimes by the same official, with no apparent sense that calling one was a concession or an insult to the other. A king with a fever might have an Asu prepare a remedy, and an Ashipu perform a protective rite on the same afternoon, and nobody involved seems to have found that contradictory. This matters for how we read K. 9204, because it tells us something about what kind of text we should expect a genuine Ashipu-authored diagnostic list to actually be. It wouldn't need to argue against physical medicine to justify itself. It wouldn't need to claim exclusive authority over the patient's well-being. It could simply do its one job: describe the behavioral signature of a specific category of affliction, confident that somewhere nearby an Asu was doing a different, complementary job, and that a sick person in this culture had access to both without having to choose. It's worth sitting, too, with just how much diagnostic vocabulary the Ashipu tradition actually developed for behavior specifically. Cuneiform medical omen texts, again, genuinely well documented, not invented for this video, catalog an enormous range of observed patient behavior with startling granularity. How a person holds their head, whether their gaze wanders or fixes, whether they answer questions promptly or with delay, whether their speech is fluent or halting, whether they weep without apparent cause or fail to weep when cause is present. This is, in the most literal sense, clinical observation, not modern in its explanatory framework, since the causes attributed to these signs were spiritual rather than neurological, but methodologically serious in a way that tends to surprise people meeting this material for the first time. The Ashipu wasn't guessing. The Ashipu was trained over years of apprenticeship in a structured, transmitted body of observational technique, passed down largely within specific families and scribal lineages, refined generation over generation the way any diagnostic craft refines itself with practice. So when we say K. 9204 reads like a checklist, we're not being loose with the comparison. We mean it reads like the output of exactly this kind of trained observational tradition. A document produced by someone who had spent years watching how people behave when something in them isn't right, and who had, at some point, decided to write the pattern down in its most concentrated, complete form. We're about to meet the man who found it, in more detail than the cold open gave you. And then, one chapter at a time, all 9. Chapter 2, The Fragment and the Man Who Buried It. Let's slow down and spend real time with the man from the cold open, because his story is the spine this whole video hangs on, and because I want to be honest with you about the shape of what we're doing. Parts of his story are documented, and parts of it are reconstructed from thin, disputed sources, and I'd rather tell you that up front than let you assume otherwise 3 hours from now. We'll call him by the working name used in the small circle of cuneiform scholars who've discussed this fragment informally, Halloran. Not a museum-assigned name, not something you'll find in an official catalogue entry, a name attached to him in a handful of secondary references, letters, and one obituary in a regional antiquarian society's newsletter from the early 20th century. By most accounts, Halloran came from nothing resembling the aristocratic academic pipeline that produced most of the famous names in early Assyriology. No family money, no Oxford pedigree. What he had was an obsessive, self-taught fluency in cuneiform, developed largely alone, working from published sign lists and grammars late into the night after long days doing unrelated clerical work. This wasn't unheard of in the field's early decades. The discipline was young enough that raw obsession could still occasionally outcompete institutional pedigree, but it was rare, and it made him, by every account we have, something of an outsider, even within the small community of people capable of reading these texts at all. He joined the museum's cataloging effort in a junior capacity in the early 1890s, decades after Layard's initial excavation, well into the long, unglamorous, and still ongoing process of actually reading through the tens of thousands of fragments that had been shipped back to London in enormous, poorly organized crates. This part is worth sitting with for a second, because it's true and it's almost never talked about. The excavation of Nineveh's library took a handful of years. Reading it, actually reading it, fragment by fragment, joining broken pieces back together, translating, cataloging, is a project that has now been running, continuously, for more than a century and a half, and it is still not finished. There are, right now, fragments in storage that no living person has fully read. Halloran was one small part of a machine that is, in a real sense, still running today. His job was tedious by design. Sort fragments by rough content category, note physical condition, flag anything that seemed to warrant closer attention from a senior scholar. Most days produced nothing worth flagging. Ration lists, fragments of the same well-known omen series duplicated for the 100th time. The grinding, unglamorous reality of archival work. And then, on a day we don't have a precise date for, the closest we can pin it down is sometime in a 2-year window in the mid-1890s. He opened a storage tray containing a badly damaged fragment that had clearly been misfiled, sitting among unrelated administrative texts, likely swept up in the same excavation basket as unrelated material and never properly separated. The physical description that survives, second-hand, through a later scholar who claims to have examined Halloran's own notes, a fragment roughly the size of a large hand, dark grey-brown clay, damaged along the left edge in a way that had clearly clipped the beginnings of several lines, with unusually fine, small cuneiform, the kind of script associated with a scribe working carefully, at leisure, rather than under time pressure. Fine script tends to mean the scribe cared about this particular copy. That detail alone would have caught a trained eye. He began transliterating, and according to the second-hand account, the line that stopped him cold, the line that made him set the fragment down, and, by his own later description, not pick it back up again for several days, occurs early, framed as an invocation, written in the elevated formal register the Utuku Lemnutu series uses throughout. It reads, in the reconstructed translation we're working from, Enki, who set the boundary of the breath at the lips, hear what is spoken of the breath taken past the boundary. If you've watched enough of this kind of content, that name, Enki, should already mean something to you. Enki is real, one of the most important gods in the entire Sumerian pantheon, god of wisdom, freshwater, crafts, and, significant for our purposes, magic and incantation. Invoking Enki at the head of a diagnostic or ritual text isn't unusual. It's exactly what you'd expect from a genuine Utuku Lemnutu style composition. What stopped Halloran, by his own account, wasn't the invocation itself, it was what came after it. Because instead of moving directly into ritual instruction, the expected next move, the burn this, recite that, structure that defines almost every other tablet in the series, the text breaks into what he described, in a phrase that later scholars have quoted repeatedly, as a list, the way an account keeper lists a debt. 9 sections, each one marked off by a small divider glyph, a device that does appear elsewhere in Mesopotamian list texts, most famously in things like king lists and ration accounts, but which is genuinely unusual to see structuring what otherwise presents as a diagnostic ritual text. It's the kind of structural echo you'll find in other Mesopotamian sources too. The 7 rulings of the underworld judges in the Descent of Inanna, for instance, use a similar numbered, escalating structure. Numbered lists, in this literary tradition, tend to build towards something. They're not neutral, they're a countdown. Halloran's surviving working notes, again, second-hand, filtered through later hands, so treat this with appropriate caution, apparently include a preview translation of all 9 section headers, done in a single sitting, before he'd worked through the detailed content of any of them individually. It's described as a fast, almost frantic pass, headers only, as if he needed to see the shape of the whole thing before he could bring himself to slow down and translate any one section properly. We have those 9 headers, in the order the tablet lists them, and we're going to spend the rest of this video, one chapter at a time, going through exactly what each one describes and, more importantly, what real, well-documented human experience each one is actually describing, underneath 5,000 years of mythic language. But before we get there, one more piece of the Halloran story, because it's the detail that gives this whole thing its emotional center, and it's the detail I find hardest to explain away as coincidence, even though, and I want to say this clearly, it absolutely could be one. Decades after his death, a private notebook attributed to Halloran surfaced in an estate sale, alongside unrelated family papers. Most of it is mundane, grammar notes, sign list cross-references, the ordinary residue of a working scholar's desk, but in the margin next to his working translation of the 4th symptom, which we'll get to properly in a couple of hours, there's a single handwritten line, in different ink from the surrounding notes, apparently added later. I have this one. I did not know I had it until I read it. We don't know what he meant. We don't know if he meant it literally, metaphorically, or as a private joke that's lost all its context now that he's not here to explain it. What we do know is that he never published a translation of the 9th and final section of K, 9204. Every other section made it, eventually, into his working papers, in a complete, careful form. The 9th is missing entirely, not damaged, not illegible, just absent, as though he stopped before he got there and never went back. So here's where we stand. 9 headers, previewed in a single sitting by a man who then spent the following months translating 8 of them in careful, complete detail, and who left the last one blank. Let's read those 9 headers now, the way Halloran apparently first saw them, as a table of contents, before we know what any of them really mean. The unfamiliar hands, the unanswered name, the borrowed face, the wait in the dark, the missing threshold, the cold room, the silent table, the second call, the fading reflection. 9. In order, exactly as he first saw them, in that single frantic pass, more than 130 years ago. We're going to take them one at a time, slowly, the way he eventually forced himself to. And for 8 of the 9, we have a genuine, well-documented, thoroughly unmysterious explanation waiting for us on the other side of the myth. Keep that in your pocket. You're going to need it. Before we move into the first symptom properly, I want to tell you one more thing about Halloran, because it's the detail that, for me, makes the whole rest of this video feel less like a spooky curiosity and more like an actual story about an actual person. The Regional Antiquarian Society newsletter that carries his obituary, the closest thing we have to an official record of his life outside the museum's own employment files, describes him, in the polite, understated language of that kind of publication, as a man of quiet habits, given to long, solitary walks, who kept to himself in his final years. It's the sort of sentence that could describe almost anyone, and normally I wouldn't make anything of it, but set against the marginal note in his private notebook, I have this one, I did not know I had it until I read it, and set against the fact that he apparently stopped translating an ancient list of 9 specific human experiences exactly one section before the end, it's hard not to wonder, at least a little, what the last years of a quiet, solitary man's life actually looked like from the inside, after he'd spent a season of his working days transcribing, in obsessive detail, 8 different descriptions of what it feels like to come slightly unstitched from your own life. I don't say that to build him into a tragic figure for the sake of the story. I don't actually know enough about his life to responsibly do that, and I'd be inventing details I don't have if I tried. I say it because I think it's the honest emotional center of why this tablet, if it's real, would have stopped a careful, professional translator in his tracks. Not because it described demons, because it described people, ordinary people, worn down by the ordinary weight of being alive, 5,000 years apart from him, saying, in a form he was uniquely equipped to hear, "This happened to me too." That's the spirit we're going to carry into the next 9 chapters. Not, is this supernatural, something closer to, has anyone else ever felt this exact thing? And did someone, somewhere, once think it was worth writing down? The answer, it turns out, again and again, is yes. Chapter 3, Symptom 1, The Unfamiliar Hands. Here's how the reconstructed translation renders the first section of K.9, 204, in the elevated register the whole fragment uses. If a man looks upon his own 2 hands, and for the space of a breath, they are the hands of another, know that something has been taken. Sit with that phrasing for a second, because it's more precise than you might expect from something this old. It's not describing a hallucination. The text isn't claiming the person sees someone else's hands. It's describing recognition failure. The hands are, visibly, the person's own hands. Nothing about them has physically changed. What's missing is the automatic, usually invisible sense of ownership that normally comes bundled with looking at a part of your own body. For a moment, the space of a breath, which is itself a nice callback to the concept we spent chapter 1 on. That sense of ownership just doesn't fire. Now let's leave the tablet for a moment and talk about what this actually is, because it's real, it's common, and it has a name. This experience, looking at part of your own body, or hearing your own voice, or looking in a mirror, and briefly experiencing it as strange, unfamiliar, not quite yours, is called depersonalization. It's one of the most well-documented phenomena in clinical psychology, and here's the detail that should immediately take some of the mystery out of it, even as it stays genuinely strange to experience. It's extremely common. Large-scale surveys consistently find that a majority of people experience at least a brief episode of depersonalization at some point in their lives. Often during periods of extreme stress, sleep deprivation, panic, marijuana use, or simply the disorienting fog of exhaustion. A brief passing episode of depersonalization, on its own, isn't considered a disorder. It's considered a normal, if unsettling, variation in ordinary human consciousness, closer to a hiccup than a diagnosis. What separates a passing experience from something clinically significant is frequency, duration, and distress. When depersonalization becomes persistent, recurring, and genuinely impairing, it can be diagnosed as depersonalization derealization disorder, which is a real, recognized, and, this matters, treatable condition. It responds to therapy, particularly approaches that target the underlying anxiety that often drives it. It is, in other words, exactly the kind of thing the fictional Ashipu in this story would have told you to also see the Asu about. Not a mystery, not a life sentence. A well-mapped, well-understood piece of how a stressed human brain sometimes behaves. So why does it happen? The leading explanations converge on something like a protective mechanism gone slightly sideways. The brain, under conditions of acute stress or threat, dialing down the intensity of ordinary sensory and emotional experience as a kind of buffer, the same general family of response that produces the numb, unreal quality people report during genuinely traumatic moments. Your hands look strange because, for a second, the part of your brain responsible for stitching "this body is me" into a seamless, automatic feeling has been momentarily deprioritized in favor of something your nervous system judged more urgent. It's not damage, it's not possession. It's closer to a system running a background process that briefly interrupts the foreground. Here's a short story to make this land, and I want to be upfront that this is a constructed, illustrative example, not a real documented case, built to make the pattern vivid rather than to claim it happened exactly this way to a specific person. Picture a nurse finishing the third consecutive night shift of a brutal week. 4 in the morning, hospital lighting doing that flat, colorless thing it does at that hour, and she's charting at a desk, running on the particular kind of exhaustion that stops feeling like tiredness and starts feeling like static. She glances down to type, and for one full second, longer than she'd like to admit, her hands on the keyboard don't register as hers. They're moving correctly. They're doing what she's telling them to do. But the core feeling of ownership, the thing that usually makes a hand feel like an extension of a self, rather than an object being watched from outside, just isn't there. She blinks, shakes it off, keeps typing. By the time she gets to the next patient's chart, it's already fading into the kind of thing you don't mention to anyone. Because how would you even start that sentence? If you've had a moment like that, you're not broken, and you're certainly not soul-taken. You're a human nervous system doing something well-documented under conditions of real strain. That's the whole explanation. It's not less interesting for being explainable. If anything, I think it's more interesting, because it means this genuinely universal experience was strange enough, 5,000 years ago, for someone to sit down and describe it with this much precision, in a culture with absolutely no access to the neuroscience we now have. Which brings us to the mythic frame, because that's the lens K.9204 offers instead. And I want to be clear, offering it as a lens is different from offering it as competing fact. The tablet's diagnosis, if this fragment is genuine, is that this moment of unfamiliarity is the signature left behind when a sliver of a person's has been shown, even briefly, to something else. The hands have been shown to a stranger, in the phrase used a few lines further into the section. The idea being that ownership, presence, the feeling of "this is mine, and I am here in it," is not automatic and permanent in this cosmology. It's something that can be borrowed against, however briefly, by something that isn't you. It's a genuinely evocative way to describe a real experience. It's also, notably, not that far in spirit from how a modern person might describe depersonalization to a friend. In plainer language, it felt like my hands weren't mine for a second. That's almost exactly what a person going through a depersonalization episode says, unprompted, without ever having heard of Sumerian demonology. Which is, I think, the genuinely interesting thing sitting underneath this whole video. Two completely disconnected traditions, separated by 5,000 years and total cultural discontinuity, independently arriving at almost identical language to describe the same internal event. I'm not telling you that proves anything about spirits or theft or ancient supernatural insight. I'm telling you the description is oddly specific for something written 5,000 years before anyone had a clinical word for it. Specific enough that a modern person reading it cold, with zero context, would probably say, "Oh, that's happened to me," without needing a single word of the mythic framing to make sense of it. There's a further piece of this worth sitting with, because it changes how strange the tablet's precision actually is once you know it. Modern researchers studying depersonalization have found that the experience clusters especially heavily around the body's own extremities. Hands, specifically, come up disproportionately often in first-person descriptions, more than faces, more than voices, more than any other single body part. Nobody knows for certain why hands specifically seem to be such a common sight for this kind of momentary unfamiliarity, though one plausible explanation is simply that hands are the part of the body we watch doing things most continuously throughout an ordinary day: typing, holding, gesturing, reaching, which means they're also the part of the body where a lapse in the usual, invisible sense of ownership has the most opportunities to actually get noticed. You'd have to be looking at your own face for the equivalent moment to register. You're looking at your hands almost constantly, without ever thinking about it, which means the glitch, when it happens, has nowhere to hide. Whoever composed K.9204 didn't reach for a face, a foot, a voice, or a heartbeat as the example for this first symptom. They reached for hands. Out of every part of the human body they could have chosen to anchor this description, they landed on the one that modern clinical interviews independently, repeatedly identify as the most common sight for exactly this experience. That could be coincidence. Hands are, after all, an intuitive, obvious choice for anyone trying to describe self-unfamiliarity. We do use them constantly. We do look at them constantly. So it's not a wild leap for an ancient observer to land there too, without needing any special insight beyond paying close attention to their own patients over years of practice. But it's the kind of detail that, once you know it, makes rereading that first line land a little differently than it did the first time through. It's worth pausing on the phrase the tablet uses one more time before we move on, the space of a breath, because it recurs, in slightly varied form, across several of the 9 sections, and I think it's doing more work than a simple figure of speech. Remember what we established in Chapter 1. It means breath, but it also means life force, vitality, the animating thing itself. Measuring a symptom's duration in breaths, rather than any other available unit, isn't incidental phrasing in a text this deliberately structured. It's tying the measurement of the disruption to the very thing the text claims is being disrupted, as though the length of a single breath is being used, quite literally, as the smallest meaningful unit this cosmology has for measuring a gap in a person's presence. A modern clinical description would reach for seconds, or a subjective duration like briefly or momentarily. This text reaches for something more intimate, the length of one single inhale and exhale, the most basic, continuous, involuntary rhythm of being alive, used as the ruler for measuring the moment that rhythm itself seems to falter. I'll leave you with the hedge one more time before we move on, because I think it belongs at the end of every one of these chapters, not just the first. I'm not telling you this proves anything. I'm telling you the description is oddly specific for something written 5,000 years before anyone had a word for it. That's Symptom 1. 8 to go. Chapter 4. Symptom 2. The unanswered name. The second section of K.9.204, in translation. If a man's name is called, and his ear receives it as though it were meant for another, and he turns only after the space between 2 heartbeats, know that something has been taken. There's a small but deliberate detail in this line worth pointing out before we go further. It's specific about timing, not if he doesn't turn, a full failure to respond, which would suggest something closer to unconsciousness or profound absence. It's specific about a delay, a gap. The information arrives, is processed, is even eventually acted on. The person does turn, but there's a lag, a beat, where the name seems to have been received by someone else first, and only second-hand relayed to the person it was actually meant for. This is a genuinely precise piece of behavioral observation, and it maps onto something real that most people have experienced and never had language for. Attentional lapses, sometimes described clinically as brief lapses in sustained attention, and more specifically, in the exact scenario the tablet describes, something close to a dissociative, zoning out moment. A gap in continuous conscious engagement with your surroundings that you weren't aware was happening until something, like your own name, pulls you back out of it. Everyone's had a version of this. Someone calls your name across a room, and there's that strange half-second where you register sound before you register meaning, before the sound resolves into, "That's me, that's my name, that's directed at me," and only after that resolution do you actually turn. Under normal conditions, that gap is small enough to be invisible, automatic, unnoticed. Under conditions of fatigue, grief, high cognitive load, or, and this is worth naming plainly, because it's a real, common, and non-pathological variation in human attention. For people with A-type attention patterns, that gap can widen noticeably. It becomes something other people start to comment on. I called your name 3 times. It becomes something you start to notice about yourself, a specific kind of absence, where you were physically present the entire time and yet weren't, in the fullest sense. There's also a grief-specific version of this that's worth naming directly, because it's extremely common and almost never talked about outside of grief support contexts. People who've recently lost someone frequently report a kind of persistent background fog, a genuine, measurable dip in attentional responsiveness that isn't a character flaw or a failure of will, but a well-documented cognitive consequence of acute grief. The mind, quite literally, has less spare processing capacity available for the ordinary business of tracking the external world, because so much of it is occupied elsewhere. If you've ever needed someone to repeat your own name to you during a hard month, that's very likely exactly what was happening, and it is neither mysterious nor shameful. A short illustrative vignette, again constructed for this video rather than a documented case. Picture a man 3 weeks after his father's funeral, back at his desk because everyone told him going back to work would help, standing in the office kitchen, waiting for the coffee machine to finish its cycle, staring at nothing in particular. A colleague calls his name from the doorway, once, then again, a little louder, a little more concerned the second time, and there's a genuine, disorienting stretch where the sound is just sound, unattached to him, unattached to anything, before it suddenly clicks into place as his name being said to him, and he turns with the slightly too wide, slightly too quick reaction of someone who's just realized they've been somewhere else. He apologizes, laughs it off, says he didn't sleep well. Nobody in that kitchen thinks anything is wrong with him. He's grieving. This is what grieving sometimes looks like from the outside, and it is, structurally, almost exactly the delay K. 9204 describes. The mythic frame the tablet offers for this is quietly beautiful. Honestly, even if you don't believe a word of the underlying cosmology, the spirit responsible for this particular taking is described as answering in the person's place. The idea being that, for that brief gap, something else has, in a sense, stepped into the space where the person's own attentiveness should have been, absorbing the sound of their name before handing it back a beat late, like a courier who took a slightly indirect route. I'm not telling you that something else answered for you the last time someone had to call your name twice. I'm telling you that a text written millennia before anyone had a framework for attention, cognition, or grief managed to isolate this specific, measurable, universal human delay and give it a name and a cause worth writing down, which tells you something, at minimum, about how closely people have always been watching each other, even without the vocabulary we have now. There's a piece of modern research worth adding here, because it sharpens exactly what the tablet is describing, rather than just gesturing at it. Studies of what's sometimes called the cocktail party effect, the well-documented phenomenon where a person can filter out an entire room of competing conversation and still reliably notice their own name spoken elsewhere in the room, even in a conversation they weren't consciously attending to at all, show that name recognition runs on a genuinely special, semi-automatic track in human hearing, distinct from how we process most other language. Your own name gets flagged by parts of your auditory system before conscious attention has fully engaged with it, which is exactly why it's so effective at pulling people out of a daydream, a book, a memory, in a way most other sounds simply don't. Which makes the specific delay the tablet describes even more interesting, because it isn't describing a total failure of this system, it's describing a partial one. The name is heard, it's flagged, it just doesn't immediately connect to the felt sense of this is being said to me, right now, by someone who wants my attention. And that gap, small as it sounds, between hearing your name and feeling addressed by it, is precisely the seam the tablet is pointing at. Under ordinary conditions, that seam is invisible, because the whole system runs fast enough to feel instantaneous. Under stress, grief, exhaustion, or distraction, the seam widens just enough to become something you notice, and something the people around you notice too. A second small vignette, because I think it's worth showing this pattern in a lighter, less heavy context than grief, to make clear how common and how ordinary this really is. Picture someone deep in a video game, headphones on, 3 hours into a Saturday afternoon they'd meant to spend on chores, and a family member calling their name from downstairs, once, then again, then a third time, each one slightly louder and more exasperated, before it finally breaks through and they surface, blinking, half apologetic, with the specific, sheepish awareness that they were, in some very real sense, somewhere else entirely for the last several minutes, name and all, until the fourth call finally found them. That's an ordinary Saturday, not a haunting, but it's built from exactly the same mechanism the tablet is describing, 5,000 years apart, right down to the counted delay. It's worth pausing, too, on why the Ashipu tradition would have cared about this specific behavior enough to build it into a diagnostic checklist at all. Remember what we covered in Chapter 1. The Ashipu's whole method was rooted in comparing a patient's current behavior against a known baseline, how they normally responded, normally moved, normally answered to their own name, and watching for deviation. A delayed response to one's own name is, from a purely observational standpoint, an almost perfect diagnostic signal because it's cheap to test, easy to notice, hard to fake convincingly, and sensitive to exactly the kind of internal disturbance, grief, exhaustion, distraction, distress, that this whole tradition was built to identify. You don't need instruments. You don't need the patient to accurately self-report an internal state they might not even have language for. You just call their name, and you watch, and you count the beats. That's a genuinely elegant piece of low-tech diagnostic design when you think about it in those terms, and it's worth noticing that this exact test, calling a name and watching for a delayed or absent response, remains, in a completely different form, part of how modern clinicians assess consciousness and attentional responsiveness even today. The instrument has changed enormously. The underlying logic of the test has not. That's symptom 2. Let's keep going. Chapter 5. Symptom 3. The borrowed face. The third section. If a man laughs, or weeps, or shows the warmth of his heart to another, and afterward cannot say which part of it was true, know that something has been taken. This one cuts a little closer than the first two, and I think you'll feel that as I read it out plainly. A person performing an emotional response, laughter, grief, warmth, convincingly enough that it registers to everyone watching as genuine, and afterward, in private, being genuinely unable to reconstruct how much of it was real and how much was performance. Not lying exactly, not faking exactly. Something stranger, a blurred line between the felt and the displayed, to the point where the person doing the displaying loses track of where one ends and the other begins. The real, well-documented territory this maps onto: emotional masking, sometimes called emotional suppression, or, in specific clinical and social contexts, masking, and it shows up in several overlapping forms worth naming individually. There's the grief version, showing up to work, to family gatherings, to ordinary social obligations, and performing a baseline of normal functioning while an enormous, unspoken weight sits underneath it, because the alternative, visible, unfiltered grief in a grocery store line or a client meeting isn't socially available to most people most of the time. This is enormously common, entirely unremarkable, and something almost everyone who has grieved anything has done, often for months, without ever naming it as a distinct thing they were doing. There's the burnout version, performing enthusiasm, engagement, or care in a job or role long after the genuine feeling has been used up, because the role requires the performance regardless of the internal state behind it, a phenomenon well studied in professions that require sustained emotional labor, like healthcare, teaching, and service work, where the gap between displayed warmth and felt warmth is a documented, named occupational hazard. And there's a broader, more general version connected back to depersonalization from Chapter 3, when a person's felt sense of their own internal states becomes unreliable or muted. Performance of an appropriate emotional response can actually become the primary, more reliable signal. You know you're supposed to look sad at a funeral, so you produce the look, and afterward, genuinely, you're not sure if the sadness came first or if the look did. None of this is a character flaw, and none of it means a person is being fundamentally dishonest with the people around them. It's an adaptive, protective pattern, a way of maintaining social function and connection even when the internal machinery isn't running at full, unfiltered capacity. The problem it can create, when it persists for a long time, is a growing sense of disconnection from your own emotional life, a feeling of watching yourself from slightly outside, performing a version of yourself for an audience that includes, uncomfortably, you. A short illustrative vignette, a woman at her grandmother's wake, greeting relatives she hasn't seen in years, accepting condolences, producing exactly the right amount of tearful smile at exactly the right moments, hugging an aunt, laughing softly at a shared memory someone brings up, doing everything a grieving granddaughter is supposed to do, competently, gracefully, all afternoon. Driving home that night, alone in the car, she tries to locate the actual grief underneath the performance, and, for a genuinely disorienting minute, can't find the seam between what she felt and what she showed. She wasn't faking. She also isn't entirely sure the tears at the wake and the numbness in the car came from the same place. The tablet's mythic frame for this is one of its more evocative lines, the face worn like a garment lent by another. The idea that in this cosmology, an expression can be borrowed the way clothing is borrowed, fitting well enough to pass, without being fully, originally yours in the moment you're wearing it. I'm not telling you your face has ever belonged to someone else. I'm telling you that the gap between what we feel and what we show is old enough and universal enough that someone was writing precise, careful language about it in cuneiform before most of the languages we speak today existed in any recognizable form. It's worth adding one more layer to this, because it's the layer that makes the tablet's phrasing feel less like poetic flourish and more like precise observation. There's a well-established distinction in modern research on emotional expression between what's sometimes called surface acting and deep acting. Surface acting is producing the correct external expression, the smile, the sympathetic frown, the tone of warmth, without the matching internal state necessarily being present underneath it. Deep acting is something subtler and, in a way, stranger, actually working to produce the internal feeling itself, so that the external expression follows naturally from something genuinely felt, at least in the moment. What research on both consistently finds is that surface acting, sustained over time, tends to produce exactly the disorientation the tablet describes, a growing inability to reliably tell, afterward, which of your own expressions were real and which were performed, because the performing itself becomes so practiced, so smooth, that it stops leaving an obvious seam behind for your own memory to grab onto. This is, worth noting, an occupational reality for enormous numbers of people: service workers, healthcare workers, teachers, customer-facing employees of every kind, whose jobs quietly require sustained emotional performance as an unstated part of the role, day after day, often for years, without anyone ever officially naming it as labor. It is labor, it has a cost, and the tablet's image, a face worn like a garment lent by another, captures something genuinely accurate about what that cost can start to feel like from the inside. Not fake exactly, but borrowed, serviceable, not fully, originally yours in the moment you're wearing it, even though, from the outside, nobody watching could ever tell the difference. It's worth noting, too, that this particular symptom is the one most likely to carry a specific kind of private guilt with it. In a way, several of the others don't. Depersonalized hands, a delayed response to your name, a chill in a familiar room. None of these tend to make a person feel like they've done something wrong. But performing warmth you're not sure you fully felt, laughing at a moment you're not sure was actually funny to you, tends to sit differently. It can feel, in retrospect, a little like deception, even toward people you love and would never actually want to deceive. I think that's worth naming plainly, because it's the kind of quiet, private guilt that rarely gets spoken aloud, and because it's almost always unearned. Producing the right expression when your internal state is muddled, exhausted, or numb isn't dishonesty. It's often the most caring thing available to you in that moment. Showing up, doing your best to meet the people around you where they need you to be, even when the internal machinery isn't fully cooperating. The tablet doesn't moralize about this symptom any more than it moralizes about the others. It just notices it, names it, and moves on. That might be worth borrowing if you've ever carried quiet guilt over a moment like this yourself. That's Symptom 3. Chapter 6, Symptom 4, The Weight in the Dark. This is the section with Halloran's margin note next to it. I have this one. I did not know I had it until I read it, so let's take it slowly. The fourth section of K. 97204. If a man wakes and cannot move his limbs and feels a weight upon his chest, as of something seated there, and cannot cry out though he wills it, know that something has been taken, and that it sits upon him even now. If that description made the hair on your arms stand up a little, I promise you're not alone, and I promise there's a very good reason it feels that specific and that familiar. This is sleep paralysis, and I want to spend extra time here because unlike most of the other symptoms in this list, sleep paralysis isn't just well documented in modern clinical terms. It has an almost unbelievably consistent, independently arising folklore tradition across cultures that had zero contact with each other, which makes it one of the single best pieces of evidence for how human experiences shape human mythology, rather than the other way around. Here's the clinical picture first, because it's genuinely reassuring once you understand the mechanism. Sleep paralysis happens at the boundary between sleep stages, most commonly as a person is either falling asleep or waking up, at the edge of REM sleep. During REM sleep, your brain deliberately paralyzes most of your voluntary muscles, a mechanism scientists believe exists specifically to stop you from physically acting out your dreams. Normally, this paralysis switches off cleanly the moment you wake up, in perfect sync with consciousness returning. Sleep paralysis is what happens when that sync fails. Your conscious mind wakes up, fully aware of your surroundings, while your body's muscles are still locked in the REM paralysis state for anywhere from a few seconds to, in rare cases, a couple of minutes. That alone would be unsettling, waking up and being unable to move. But sleep paralysis has a second, even stranger feature that shows up with remarkable consistency across cases. A significant proportion of people experiencing it report a vivid, specific sensation of presence in the room, often described as sitting on or pressing down on the chest, accompanied by intense fear and sometimes brief, dreamlike hallucinations layered on top of the waking, paralyzed state, a phenomenon related to what researchers call hypnagogic and hypnopompic hallucination, vivid, dreamlike perceptions that bleed into waking consciousness at the edges of sleep. The leading explanation is that the brain, still partially in a REM-adjacent dream state, is generating threat detection and dream imagery processes simultaneously with waking awareness, and the combination, real paralysis, real fear response, dream-generated sensory content, produces an experience that feels, from the inside, unmistakably like something is here, and it means you harm, and you cannot move to stop it. And here's the detail that makes this chapter's title what it is. Cultures all over the world, with no historical contact with each other, independently developed strikingly similar folkloric explanations for this exact experience, almost always involving some kind of malevolent nighttime visitor sitting on the sleeper's chest. English folklore has the old hag, the origin, in fact, of the very word nightmare, which originally referred specifically to this kind of visitation, not to bad dreams in general. Newfoundland folklore has a nearly identical figure, also called the old hag, described in almost the same physical terms. Japanese folklore has kanashibari, literally bound in metal, describing the same paralysis, often attributed to a spirit sitting on the chest. Scandinavian folklore has the mare, a similar nocturnal visitor. West African and Caribbean traditions across multiple distinct cultures independently produced comparable figures. This is, genuinely, one of the strongest documented cases in all of folklore studies of a universal human physiological experience producing convergent mythology across cultures that had no way to influence each other, which is a real, well-established finding, not speculation. Against that backdrop, the Lilu and Lilitu, the real Mesopotamian night-wandering spirits we introduced back in Chapter 1, fit precisely into this same pattern. They're not an isolated invention. They're Mesopotamia's specific entry in a genuinely global tradition of naming this exact experience. A short illustrative vignette, someone falling asleep on their back after a stressful week of disrupted sleep, a known risk factor for sleep paralysis episodes. Waking, fully aware, unable to turn their head, unable to call out, with the unmistakable, overwhelming sense that something is in the room, at the foot of the bed, moving closer, and a pressure building on the chest that has no physical cause whatsoever. It lasts perhaps 40 seconds. It feels, in the moment, like the most real thing that has ever happened to them. And then it breaks, all at once, and the room is empty, and their heart is pounding, and there is genuinely nothing there, and never was. If this has happened to you, you are not haunted, and you're one of a very large number of people who've experienced exactly this. It's worth knowing that frequent sleep paralysis is often connected to sleep deprivation, irregular sleep schedules, sleeping on your back, and elevated stress, all manageable, addressable factors. And if it's happening often enough to be genuinely distressing, that's absolutely worth raising with a doctor, because there are real, effective approaches to reducing how often it occurs. It's also worth naming how differently cultures have historically responded to this experience once it's recognized as a known, shared phenomenon rather than a private, isolated terror. In a number of documented traditions, simply being told, plainly, that this is a common experience with a name and that other people go through it too, measurably reduces how distressing subsequent episodes feel, not because the paralysis itself changes, but because the fear response is partly built on the sense of being alone with something inexplicable, and that particular ingredient of the fear turns out to be genuinely removable just by hearing someone else say, "Yes, that happens, you're not the only one." I'd like to think that's part of what a fictional Ashipu, sitting across from a frightened patient, describing a weight on their chest, would have been offering too, underneath all the ritual language, the simple, powerful relief of being told your experience has a name and a history, and that you are not the first person it has ever happened to. The tablet's frame here needs almost no embellishment, because the mythic and the clinical descriptions are, remarkably, nearly identical already. The weight, the paralysis, the presence, the inability to cry out. I'm not telling you a Lilu ever sat on anyone's chest. I'm telling you that essentially every culture in recorded human history that has left us folklore has independently arrived at almost this exact image to describe this exact, real, physiological event, which might be the single most striking pattern in this entire video. There's one more layer to the cross-cultural pattern worth adding, because it's the detail that made this the chapter I most wanted to get right. Researchers who study sleep paralysis folklore across cultures have noted that the specific of the hallucinated presence often reflects locally specific cultural fears and figures. A hag in England, a specific named demon in parts of Southeast Asia, alien abduction narratives in some strands of modern Western reporting from the latter 20th century onward, while the of the experience stays remarkably constant everywhere it's been documented. Paralysis, a sense of presence, chest pressure, overwhelming fear, brief duration, sudden release. This is close to a textbook example of how a single, universal physiological event gets dressed in whatever explanatory clothing a given culture has available at the time, which means Lilu and Lilitu aren't an isolated ancient superstition at all. They're Mesopotamia's specific cultural clothing on an experience so consistent, biologically, that it shows up wearing different names in essentially every documented human culture we've ever been able to study on the question. It's also worth naming plainly, for anyone who's had this experience and found it genuinely frightening, the fear during a sleep paralysis episode is real and intense, specifically because the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, remains highly active during this REM-adjacent state, effectively primed for danger, while the higher reasoning centers that would normally provide calming context are still coming back online. You are not imagining the fear. It is a real, measurable, physiologically driven fear response, layered onto a real, measurable, physiologically driven paralysis. What isn't real is the presence itself. Knowing that doesn't always make the next episode feel less terrifying in the moment. Fear responses aren't always obedient to what we know intellectually, but it does mean that what's happening to you, when it happens, has a name, has been studied extensively, and has genuine, practical management strategies, starting with the sleep hygiene factors mentioned above. That's symptom 4, and it's the one Halloran apparently recognized in himself. Chapter 7, Symptom 5, The Missing Threshold, the 5th section. If a man arrives at his own door and cannot say by what road his feet carried him, or stands in a place and knows he has stood there before, though it cannot be so, know that something has been taken. Notice this section actually folds together two related but distinct experiences, and the tablet treats them as two expressions of a single underlying condition, which, as it turns out, is a genuinely reasonable way to group them, because both involve a mismatch between what your conscious, narrating mind remembers and what actually happened. The first is what we might call autopilot cognition, sometimes discussed under the more casual label highway hypnosis, the extremely common experience of driving, walking, or otherwise navigating a familiar route while your conscious attention is entirely elsewhere, and arriving at your destination with no continuous memory of the journey itself. This is well understood. Familiar, well-practiced tasks require dramatically less conscious, deliberate attention than novel ones, and the brain is perfectly capable of running a complex, safety-relevant task like driving, using largely automatic, practiced routines, while conscious awareness drifts off to plan dinner, replay an argument, or simply go quiet. It's not dangerous in itself for the vast majority of ordinary, familiar route situations, though it's a genuine reminder of just how much of ordinary behavior runs without full conscious narration attached to it, which is, when you actually sit with it, a slightly vertiginous thing to realize about yourself. The second, déjà vu, genuinely one of the most studied and still, honestly, most fascinating phenomena in memory research. The overwhelming majority of people experience déjà vu at some point, that unmistakable, specific sensation of having lived through a present moment before, despite knowing, rationally, that you haven't. The leading scientific explanations converge on some kind of minor hiccup in how the brain's memory and recognition systems talk to each other. One family of theories suggests a brief, faulty firing of the brain's familiarity detection circuitry, producing a strong feeling of, "I've experienced this," that isn't attached to any actual matching memory, essentially, a false positive signal in the recognition system. Another family of theories focuses on split-second processing delays between the two hemispheres of the brain, where one side registers a scene fractionally before the other, and the second registration gets misfiled as a memory of the first, rather than a live perception. Neither of these has anything to do with anything supernatural, but both are areas of genuinely active, ongoing research. Déjà vu remains, in a real sense, only partially explained even now, which is a fair thing to say plainly rather than overstate. What connects these two experiences, and what the tablet seems to be gesturing at by grouping them together, is a shared quality, a break in the normal, continuous thread of felt experience that stitches what I am doing right now to what I remember doing. In autopilot cognition, the thread goes slack because attention wandered. In déjà vu, the thread produces a false echo, doubling a moment that should only have happened once. Both leave you standing somewhere, physically, literally standing there, with a strange, momentary uncertainty about your own continuity through time. A short illustrative vignette, someone pulling into their own driveway after a 20-minute commute they've made 1,000 times, and realizing, with a small jolt, that they cannot recall a single traffic light, a single turn, a single moment of the drive, that the last clear memory is pulling out of the office parking lot, and the next clear memory is turning off the engine at home, with 20 minutes of lived experience that happened, undeniably, to their body, and left no trace in their conscious recollection at all. It's unsettling for exactly as long as it takes to reassure themselves that nothing went wrong. The car is fine, they're fine, they arrived safely, and then it's forgotten. The way this kind of moment almost always is, filed away as one of the small, ordinary strangenesses of being a person who has more automatic behavior running underneath conscious awareness than most of us like to admit. The tablet's mythic frame, the road was walked by the taken part, not the whole. The idea that when your feet carry you somewhere, without your full present attention along for the ride, it's because a portion of what makes you fully present wasn't actually there for that stretch of road. Something else, something borrowed, was doing the walking on your behalf. I'm not telling you a missing piece of you drove your commute for you. I'm telling you that the actual, real explanation, that conscious attention and automatic bodily competence are two separable systems that don't always run in lockstep, is, if you actually sit with it, nearly as strange as the myth, and a text with no access to neuroscience still managed to notice the gap and describe it accurately enough that it needs almost no translation to make sense to a modern reader. One more thread worth pulling on the déjà vu half of this chapter, because it connects back to something from chapter 1 that's easy to miss on a first pass. Some of the more compelling recent research treats déjà vu not as a memory error exactly, but as something closer to a memory, a moment where the brain's familiarity detection system flags a scene as matching something in memory, runs a rapid unconscious search, fails to find an actual matching memory, and yet the initial "this feels familiar" signal has already fired strongly enough that it reaches conscious awareness before the failed search does. Under this account, déjà vu isn't a malfunction so much as a visible seam in a process that's normally completely invisible. You're catching your own memory system in the act of checking its work, which it does constantly, silently, thousands of times a day, and which you almost never get to observe directly. That idea, catching a normally invisible internal process in the act of running, is, in a way, the theme connecting every symptom in this entire list, and it's worth naming out loud here in the middle of the video, because it reframes everything we've covered so far and everything still ahead of us. Ownership of your hands, recognition of your name, the seam between felt and performed emotion, continuous memory of your own movements through space. None of these are things you normally notice happening. They just happen, seamlessly, underneath conscious awareness, all day, every day, for your entire life. What K.94204 seems to be doing, symptom after symptom, is cataloging the specific, narrow conditions under which each of these invisible processes briefly becomes visible. Glitches, in the most literal sense, in systems so reliable you never think about them until for one bad moment, they don't run quite right. There's a reason this particular symptom sits at the exact midpoint of the tablet's 9, and I think it's worth pointing out, even though we can't know for certain it was deliberate. The 4 symptoms before it, the hands, the name, the face, the weight in the dark, are all, in different ways, about a disruption in your relationship to your body and your own immediate sensations. The 4 symptoms after it, the cold room, the silent table, the second call, the fading reflection, start moving outward into your relationship with places, with pleasure, with the sounds and reflections of the world around you. The missing threshold, sitting right in the center, is the one symptom that's explicitly about movement through space, about the literal journey between one part of your life and another. If this tablet has a structure at all beyond a simple numbered list, and I want to be honest that this is speculative, a pattern that may or may not have been intentional on the part of whoever composed it, this is the chapter where the list pivots from what's happening inside a person to how that internal disruption starts reaching outward into the rest of their world. That's Symptom 5. Chapter 8, Symptom 6, the cold room. The 6th section. If a man stands in a place known to him, a place of safety, and a coldness comes upon him, and a dread with no cause he can name, and the hair of his arms rises, though no wind moves, know that something has been taken, and that it has passed through that place before him. This is, honestly, the section that most closely resembles the kind of thing you'd expect from a straightforward ghost story, and I think it's worth being especially careful and especially honest here, because this is exactly the territory where a lot of pseudo-supernatural content stops being careful. So let's be careful. The experience being described, a sudden, causeless chill and sense of dread in a familiar, otherwise unremarkable space, is genuinely common, and it has more than one perfectly ordinary explanation, and I want to walk through the real ones plainly before we get anywhere near the myth. The first is straightforwardly physiological. Anxiety and acute stress responses produce measurable changes in peripheral blood flow, redirecting blood away from the skin's surface toward core muscles as part of the body's threat response system. The same general mechanism behind cold feet as an idiom for nervousness. A sudden spike in anxiety, even one your conscious mind hasn't identified a clear trigger for, can produce a genuine, physically real sensation of chill, along with the hair-raising response. Piloerection, the same reflex that puffs up an animal's fur, which is a real, ancient, and entirely involuntary part of the mammalian fear response, triggered by the same stress hormones, regardless of whether the threat is a physical predator or an unnamed, formless unease. The second explanation is more mundane and, frankly, more common than people assume. Ordinary environmental drafts, temperature gradients near old windows or doorways, or changes in airflow that a distracted mind doesn't consciously register as a draft, but does register as an unexplained chill, which, once your nervous system has already registered a chill without an obvious cause, can itself trigger a small anxiety spike, which then produces the psychological sense of dread as a secondary effect layered on top of the physical one. And the third explanation is the one I think is most worth sitting with, because it's not about the moment itself, it's about memory, confirmation bias, applied to memory formation. Here's the thing about a moment of unexplained chill and dread in a familiar space. It's memorable precisely because it's unusual. You will remember, vividly, the one time you felt a sudden inexplicable dread in your own hallway. You will not remember the several thousand entirely unremarkable times you walked through that same hallway feeling nothing at all, because there's nothing about an unremarkable moment that gets flagged for long-term storage. Over years, this produces a systematically skewed personal archive, a handful of genuinely strange-feeling moments, remembered in vivid, specific detail, and an enormous, invisible backdrop of ordinary moments that never made it into memory at all, creating the false impression of a pattern. That hallway always feels off, built almost entirely from a tiny, cherry-picked, highly memorable sample. None of this makes the experience less real in the moment. It absolutely happens. The chill is physically real, the dread is genuinely felt, the hair-raising is a real reflex. What it means is that the experience doesn't require anything having passed through the space, in the tablet's phrase, to be fully, completely explained. A short illustrative vignette, someone standing in their childhood bedroom, back visiting parents for a holiday, room barely changed in 20 years, and feeling, for no identifiable reason, a sudden coldness and unease, strong enough to make them want to leave the room. No memory attached, no clear trigger, nothing they can point to. They mention it to a sibling later, half joking, and the sibling says, with a strange seriousness, that they've felt exactly the same thing in that exact corner of the room, more than once, over the years. Neither of them can explain it. Neither of them needs a supernatural explanation for it to be a genuinely eerie shared moment. Two nervous systems, in a room with a real, physical draft near an old window frame that neither of them has consciously identified, both producing the same well-understood physiological chain of chill, piloerection, and dread, and both filing the moment away as memorable specifically because it stood out from thousands of unremarkable visits to the same room. The mythic frame, the room remembers what walked through it, a lovely, evocative idea, and one that requires nothing supernatural to be true in a metaphorical sense. Rooms don't remember, but the people standing in them absolutely do, selectively, imperfectly, in ways that quietly shape which moments feel haunted and which don't. I'm not telling you your childhood bedroom is haunted. I'm telling you that a place feels wrong for no reason is one of the oldest reported human experiences on record, and it has a real, physiological, entirely unmysterious explanation that was sitting undiscovered for millennia while people wrote poetry about it instead. There's a fourth factor worth naming here too, one that's more social than physiological, and it's specific to spaces you already have some emotional history with, which a place known to him, a place of safety, absolutely qualifies as. Psychologists who study place memory have found that emotionally significant spaces, childhood homes, rooms tied to specific memories, houses connected to people who've died, carry a kind of accumulated emotional weight that can surface unpredictably, triggered by small unconscious sensory cues you're not even aware of noticing. A particular quality of light at a particular time of day, a smell too faint to consciously register, the specific creak of a floorboard that your body remembers even when your conscious mind has long since filed the association away. None of that requires anything to have passed through the room. It only requires that you, personally, have a history with that room substantial enough for your nervous system to still be quietly keeping track of it, years later, in ways your conscious mind isn't tracking at all. Put all four of these factors together: real physiological chill response, environmental drafts, the memory skewing effect of unusual moments being disproportionately memorable, and the accumulated unconscious weight of emotionally significant spaces, and you have a complete, sufficient explanation for essentially every "this room feels off" experience most people will ever report in their lives, without needing to reach for anything that walked through the room before you did. I think it's worth being honest, too, about why this particular symptom is the hardest one in the whole list to fully talk yourself out of in the moment, even once you know all four explanations cold. Knowing that a chill has a physiological cause doesn't switch off the physiological cause. Knowing that dread is just an involuntary stress response doesn't make the dread feel less immediate while you're standing in the room actually having it. That's true of most of the symptoms on this list. Honestly, explanation and felt experience run on different tracks, and understanding a mechanism intellectually rarely reaches all the way down to override what your body is doing in real time. I don't think that's a flaw in the explanations. I think it's just an honest acknowledgement that being a body, with all its automatic, ancient, occasionally overzealous alarm systems, isn't something you can fully outthink, even when you know exactly what's happening and exactly why. That's Symptom 6. Chapter 9. Symptom 7. The Silent Table. I want to change register slightly for this one, because this is the chapter that matters most, and I'd rather tell you that directly than let the pacing sneak up on you. The 7th section of K9204. If a man sits at his own table, before food he once loved, and it is ash in his mouth, though nothing is wrong with it, and the things that once gave him gladness give him nothing. Know that something has been taken, and has taken the largest part. That last phrase, has taken the largest part, is the only place in the entire fragment where the text ranks the severity of what it's describing, and it ranks this one, out of all 9, as the deepest cut. The real, well-documented condition this maps onto is called anhedonia, the diminished or complete loss of the capacity to feel pleasure or interest in activities that previously brought it. And I want to be very direct with you here, more direct than in any of the previous chapters. This is not a curious, mildly eerie phenomenon in the way sleep paralysis or déjà vu are. Anhedonia is one of the core, defining symptoms of clinical depression, and it's also a genuine symptom that can appear in grief, in chronic stress, in a number of medical conditions, and on its own, as a standalone experience worth taking seriously regardless of what else is going on. If food has stopped tasting like anything, if music you used to love just sits there, inert, doing nothing to you, if time with people you care about used to fill you up and now just passes, flat, without anything landing, that is worth talking to a real person about, a doctor, a therapist, someone you trust enough to say the actual sentence out loud. Not because there's anything shameful about it, there absolutely is not, and it is far more common than most people talking about it out loud would suggest, but because, unlike several of the other symptoms on this list, this one has real, effective treatments, and going without help for a long time when help is genuinely available is the actual tragedy hiding underneath this myth, not the myth itself. I'm going to keep the vignette here shorter and gentler than the others because I don't want to dramatize this one the way I've let myself dramatize the others. Picture someone sitting down to a meal they used to look forward to, a specific dish tied to a specific memory, the kind of food that used to mean something, and noticing, with a quiet, private kind of alarm, that it simply doesn't. Not that it tastes bad, that it tastes like nothing in particular, that the whole ritual of the meal, the thing that used to be a small, reliable pocket of warmth in an ordinary day, has gone hollow, and they can't say exactly when that happened, only that it has. If that's familiar to you, even a little, even not all the way to that description, please don't file it away as an eerie coincidence with an old tablet and move on to the next chapter. That's the one thing I'd ask you to actually act on out of this entire 3 hours. Talk to someone. It matters more than the myth does, and the myth would agree with me. The tablet's own frame for this, interestingly, doesn't romanticize it the way it does some of the others. The line is blunt. The taker eats what the mouth no longer tastes. Even inside its own mythology, this symptom isn't described with the same eerie fascination as the others. It's described as loss, plainly, without much poetry dressing it up. I think that's worth noticing. Even a 5,000-year-old diagnostic text seems to understand that this particular symptom deserves to be taken more seriously than the others, not turned into entertainment. I want to add one more thing here, gently, because I think it belongs in this chapter specifically. Anhedonia doesn't always look dramatic from the outside, and it doesn't always feel dramatic from the inside either. It's rarely a sudden collapse. More often, by every account of people who've lived through it, it's a slow fade, a gradual dimming of things that used to matter, so gradual that it's genuinely hard to notice while it's happening, and only obvious in retrospect, looking back at a version of yourself who cared about things you can barely remember caring about now. That gradualness is exactly what makes it worth naming out loud rather than waiting to notice it on your own, because the slow version is very easy to mistake for simply getting older or getting busier or that's just how life is now, explanations that feel plausible enough to keep you from ever bringing it up to anyone. So I'll say the disclaimer here warmly, not clinically because that's what this one deserves. If any part of this chapter described something true about how you've been feeling, you deserve support, real support, from a real person, and it is available, and reaching for it is not a small or embarrassing thing to do. It's the single most useful thing anyone watching this video could take away from it. I also want to say, plainly, that recognizing yourself in this chapter doesn't mean anything is fundamentally broken about you, and it doesn't mean you've failed at anything. It means something in your life or your body needs attention, the same way a persistent physical pain would mean something needs attention. We don't treat a persistent ache in the same part of your back for 6 months as a personal failing. We treat it as a signal worth actually listening to. This deserves exactly the same treatment, and it's every bit as legitimate a reason to reach out for help as any physical symptom would be. If the Ashapu of this story understood that this symptom, out of all 9, was the one worth naming as the largest part, I'd like to think a modern version of the same instinct is worth listening to now, 5,000 years later, with far better tools available to actually do something about it. That's symptom 7. Let's go gentler with the last 2 before we get to the pattern chapter. Chapter 10, symptom 8, the second call. The 8th section. If a man hears his name spoken clearly in a room where he is alone, in a voice he cannot place, though it seems he should know it, know that something has been taken and still answers to what it borrowed. After the weight of the last chapter, this one is a slightly easier place to land, because it's genuinely one of the most common, best understood, and least alarming experiences on this entire list, even though it can be, in the moment, extremely startling. This is auditory pareidolia, combined with hypnagogic hallucination, 2 related but distinct phenomena that frequently overlap in exactly the scenario the tablet describes. Auditory pareidolia is the auditory version of the more commonly discussed visual phenomenon, the same general tendency that makes people see a face in a cloud or an electrical outlet applied to sound. The human brain is, by design, extraordinarily good at pattern matching, and specifically, extraordinarily tuned to detect human voices and human faces, because across our evolutionary history, correctly and quickly identifying "that's a person" carried enormous survival value. This tuning is so aggressive that it regularly produces false positives, ambient noise, a fan, a pipe, wind against a window, the settling creak of a house, gets pattern matched by an overzealous auditory system into something that briefly resolves as a voice, sometimes even as a specific, recognizable word or name, before the more careful, conscious part of the brain catches up and reclassifies it correctly. Hypnagogic hallucination adds a second layer specifically relevant to the empty room framing in the tablet. These are vivid, often extremely realistic sensory experiences, auditory, visual, or both, that occur specifically at the transitional edges of sleep, as the brain begins entering or exiting sleep states while consciousness is still partially engaged. Hearing your own name spoken clearly, in a specific and sometimes even recognizable voice, during these transitional windows is one of the most commonly reported forms of hypnagogic experience, and it happens to a very large proportion of people at some point, often during periods of tiredness or irregular sleep, without indicating anything unusual about a person's mental health. What makes this experience land with the particular eerie specificity the tablet describes, a voice he cannot place though it seems he should know it, is a genuinely interesting quirk of how these false positive detections work, because the brain's voice recognition system is trying to match the sound to something familiar. The hallucinated or misheard voice often carries a strong, frustrating sense of near recognizability without ever resolving into an actual identifiable person. It sounds like someone, specifically, and yet the moment you try to pin down who, the sense dissolves, which is exactly the quality that makes this experience so much stranger, in the moment, than a simple unexplained noise would be. A short illustrative vignette, someone home alone on a quiet evening, deep in a book or a task, hearing their name spoken clearly and distinctly from what seems like the next room, not a shout, not urgent, just a plain, clear utterance of their name, in a voice that has a familiar quality, without belonging to anyone they can place, and looking up, heart briefly elevated, to an empty house and total silence. They check the other room anyway, because of course they do. Nothing. A fan running, a pipe settling, the house, doing what old houses and quiet evenings do to an alert, pattern-hungry human brain. The tablet's mythic frame, the name still owed to whoever borrowed it, the idea, within this cosmology, that whatever briefly took a piece of a person's presence in an earlier symptom is, in this moment, still partially answering to that person's name, as though a debt of identity hasn't yet been fully returned. I'm not telling you a borrowed piece of you is still out there, answering to your name in empty rooms. I'm telling you that the human brain's voice detection system is aggressive enough, and the edges of sleep are strange enough, that this specific, oddly detailed experience, clear enough to be startling, familiar enough to feel like it should mean something, impossible to pin down enough to never quite resolve, has apparently been common enough, for long enough, that someone wrote it down as its own distinct diagnostic category, 5,000 years before anyone had the word hallucination available to reach for instead. Worth noting too, since it connects this chapter back to Chapter 6. Surveys asking people directly whether they've ever heard their name called, with no one present, find that a genuinely large share of otherwise ordinary adults, with no other unusual experiences to report, say yes, often describing it as a one-time or rare occurrence tied to a specific period of exhaustion or stress, rather than a recurring pattern. That's worth knowing precisely, because this is one of the symptoms on this list most likely to make a person quietly worry something is wrong with them the first time it happens, when the actual statistical reality is closer to, this is one of the single most common, unusual auditory experiences a healthy human brain produces, common enough that it barely counts as unusual at all, once you know the numbers. There's also a specific reason this symptom tends to land harder emotionally than a lot of ordinary misperceptions, and it has to do with what your own name actually represents, cognitively and emotionally. Your name isn't just a sound. From early childhood onward, it's the single auditory signal most tightly bound to your sense of being addressed, being seen, being specifically singled out by another mind as worth speaking to. That's precisely why the cocktail party effect we discussed earlier exists in the first place. Your brain has decided, over a lifetime of experience, that this particular sound is worth breaking through everything else to notice. So when a misfire in the same system produces that sound where nothing produced it, the emotional charge attached is disproportionately large compared to, say, misperceiving a random creak as a footstep. It doesn't just sound like something, it sounds like someone, specifically, wanting you. That's what makes this particular misperception land with the eerie specificity it does. And it's also exactly why an observant ancient tradition, watching for behavioral signs of distress in their patients, would have found it worth asking about directly. That's Symptom 8. One more before the pattern chapter. Chapter 11. Symptom 9. The Fading Reflection. We've arrived at the section Halloran never translated. Everything from here forward on this particular passage is reconstructed from what we can piece together independently, later scholars working from the physical fragment itself, since his own notes simply stop. The 9th section, as best as it can currently be rendered, if a man turns from his own reflection because he cannot bear the space of a breath it takes to arrive, or feels that what looks back has settled a moment after he has, know that the greatest part has been taken, and the Ashipu must be sent for before the sun sets twice more. Notice the shift in tone from every previous section. This is the only one of the 9 that includes an urgent instruction, rather than simply a description. Every other symptom is presented, structurally, as observation. If this happens, know that something has been taken. This one adds a clock. Send for the Ashipu, before the sun sets twice more. Whatever this fragment believes is happening, it apparently believed this 9th symptom marked a threshold worth acting on urgently, not just noting. The real phenomenon underneath it is genuinely fascinating, and importantly, well documented in modern psychological research. It's sometimes called the strange face illusion, and it's one of those rare cases where you can actually go read the original research yourself, because it comes from a specific, replicated set of experiments. Here's the setup. A person sits in dim, low-contrast lighting, at a comfortable distance from a mirror, and simply looks at their own reflection continuously for around 10 minutes, without looking away. Under these specific conditions, low light, sustained unbroken gaze, no other visual stimulation to distract the eyes, a very large majority of participants in studies of this phenomenon report genuinely strange perceptual effects, the face in the mirror seeming to distort, age, shift into the face of a stranger, or in some reported cases, take on distinctly unsettling or monstrous qualities, entirely within the observer's own perception, with nothing actually changing about the reflection itself. The leading explanation involves a well-documented visual phenomenon related to sustained fixation. When the eyes stare at anything, without their normal, small, involuntary movements, called saccades, refreshing the visual input, the brain's face processing system, which normally relies on a huge amount of automatic, unconscious updating to maintain a stable sense of a face it's looking at, starts to lose its grip on that stability. Combined with low light reducing the amount of fine detail actually available to the eyes, the face recognition system, deprived of its normal steady stream of confirming detail, begins effectively guessing, filling gaps with pattern-matched approximations pulled from memory and expectation rather than fresh sensory data. And because human face recognition is so heavily tuned toward detecting anomaly and threat, those unconstrained guesses often skew toward the uncanny rather than the neutral. The specific detail in the tablet, what looks back has settled a moment after he has, a perceived delay between the observer's movement and the reflection's response, connects to this same general family of effect. Under exactly these viewing conditions, participants frequently report exactly this sensation, a lag, a sense that the reflection is trailing a half-beat behind, even though a mirror is, obviously, physically instantaneous. A short illustrative vignette, someone in a dimly lit bathroom late at night, brushing their teeth, catching their own eye in the mirror for longer than usual. The kind of accidental, sustained eye contact with your own reflection that doesn't happen often, because we mostly look at mirrors functionally, briefly, not searchingly, and noticing, with a creeping unease they can't quite justify, that their own face has started to look subtly wrong. Not different exactly, just delayed, just slightly unclaimed, as though the person in the mirror is a half step behind actually being them. They look away, turn on a brighter light, and it passes instantly, the way it reliably does the moment normal viewing conditions return. The mythic frame the reconstructed text offers is the starkest of all 9, the unclaimed likeness. The idea that a reflection with no one fully, presently behind it, is the last and deepest place the Ashipu would need to look, because by this point, in the tablet's own internal logic, there's barely enough of the original person left standing in front of the mirror to claim the face looking back at them. I'm not telling you your reflection has ever belonged to someone else, even for a half second in bad bathroom lighting. I'm telling you that this exact effect is real, replicated, has a name, and has a genuine, entirely non-supernatural explanation rooted in how vision and face recognition work under specific, unusual viewing conditions, and that a fragment, written millennia ago, in a system with none of that science available, apparently considered it serious enough to attach the only urgent instruction in the entire text. There's a final piece of the strange face illusion research worth including, because it's the detail that makes the tablet's urgency, the only urgent line in the entire text, feel a little less arbitrary. Researchers running these studies have noted that participants' reactions vary enormously. Some find the effect merely curious, a fun perceptual party trick to describe afterward. A meaningful number of others, however, report the experience as genuinely, viscerally distressing in the moment, strong enough that some studies build in explicit off-ramps, allowing participants to stop early if the sustained mirror-gazing becomes too uncomfortable to continue. There's something worth sitting with in the fact that a simple, harmless perceptual illusion, produced by nothing more exotic than dim light and a long stare, can reliably produce that intensity of reaction in ordinary, psychologically healthy adults, in a controlled lab setting, with full awareness that it's just their own face in an ordinary mirror. If a modern person, sitting safely in a research lab, can be shaken by 10 minutes of their own reflection, it's not hard to imagine why an ancient diagnostic tradition, one without any framework for just a known visual effect, nothing to worry about, might have looked at this same experience and decided it warranted the most urgent line in the whole text. Not because anything is actually wrong when it happens, because it feels like something is more wrong than any of the other 8 symptoms, even when, clinically, it's arguably one of the more mundane and best understood entries on this entire list. There's a fitting symmetry in closing the list here. On the mirror, right where it opened, on the hands, both symptoms built around a moment of failed self-recognition, both anchored in looking directly at part of yourself and, for a stretch of time too short to properly measure, but too long to comfortably ignore, not quite finding yourself there. If this text does have an intentional structure, bookending the list this way is an elegant piece of composition, whether or not anyone involved in writing it thought of it in those terms. It takes you from your hands, the most mundane, constantly observed part of your body, all the way to your own face, the part of you most bound up with your sense of identity, and ends there, at the threshold of the mirror, with the only instruction in the entire text to go get help before the sun sets twice more. That's the 9th symptom. That's the one Halloran left blank. Now let's talk about what the Ashipu was actually supposed to do about all of this, and then let's talk about the pattern. Chapter 12. What the Ashipu actually did about it. Let's step back from the 9 symptoms for a moment and talk about what actually happened next in this cosmology once a diagnosis had been made, because this is real, historically grounded material, and it's some of the most genuinely reassuring content in this entire video, once you understand it properly. We have real, surviving ritual texts describing exactly this kind of treatment process, and 2 in particular are worth naming, because both are well documented and both give us a clear picture of what an actual Ashipu's care plan looked like. The first is the Maklu series. The name literally means burning, a substantial collection of incantations and ritual instructions centered on symbolically identifying, naming, and destroying the source of affliction, often through the ritual burning of figurines or representations meant to stand in for whatever was responsible. The second is the Shurpu series, a related but distinct word, again connected to burning and purification, focused more specifically on ritual release from various forms of binding, guilt, or affliction, often through a structured process of naming possible causes one at a time and symbolically loosening the sufferer from each. What both of these real texts have in common, and what's genuinely worth sitting with, is that they describe process, not a single incantation and done. A structured sequence, identify what's wrong, name it specifically rather than vaguely, perform a ritual act of release or destruction, and reinforce, repeatedly, throughout, restore the sufferer to their ordinary, functioning place in their family and community. And here's the detail that I think matters most for this entire video, the one thing I'd ask you to actually carry with you. Real, documented Ashipu practice was never presented, in the actual historical record, as a complete substitute for the Asu's physical medicine. The two roles worked in tandem. A person suffering in the ways we've spent the last 2 hours describing would, in the historically accurate version of this system, plausibly have been seen by both practitioners, the Ashipu addressing the behavioral, relational, and what they understood as spiritual dimension of the affliction, and the Asu, alongside that, addressing diet, rest, physical remedies, and bodily care. Neither role considered itself sufficient on its own. The system, as actually practiced, built in redundancy, more than one kind of care, running at the same time, for the same suffering person. I find that detail almost more interesting than anything mythological about this whole story, honestly. A culture we tend to think of, from a great historical distance, as purely superstitious, had, in practice, a working referral system between two different modes of care, something that took modern medicine a very long time to fully re-embrace, and that a lot of people, even now, still don't have easy access to. So here's the honest, straightforward version of the modern parallel, stated plainly rather than left implied. If this fragment is genuine, and if the Ashipu who wrote it was doing their job the way the real historical record suggests Ashipu generally did, the Ashipu himself would have told you to also go see the other doctor. That instruction is baked into the actual system this fictional tablet claims to be part of. The myth, taken on its own terms, was never meant to stand alone. That's the piece I wanted you to have before we go into the pattern chapter, because everything we're about to discuss about suppression, disappearance, and Halloran's missing translation gets more interesting, not less, once you understand that even inside its own internal logic, this system never claimed to be the whole answer. It's worth taking a moment to describe what an actual Maklu-style ritual sequence involved in practice, because the structure itself is genuinely instructive. A typical sequence would open with an invocation, calling on relevant deities, often including Enki and the fire god Gira, whose domain over flame made him central to a ritual literally named burning. The sufferer, or a figurine standing in for whatever was afflicting them, would be formally named and addressed, out loud, specifically, not vaguely gestured at, but named, because in this tradition, correctly naming a source of harm was itself considered a form of power over it. This is, worth pausing on, a genuinely old and genuinely widespread idea across many unrelated human traditions, that vague, unnamed fear is more dangerous than fear that's been specifically identified and spoken aloud, and that the act of naming something precisely is itself a meaningful first step toward being able to do something about it. It's not a bad piece of practical psychology, even stripped entirely of its ritual context. After the naming came the symbolic act itself, burning a representative figurine, dissolving a knotted cord in water, breaking a sealed vessel, followed, and this is the part that tends to get left out of popular retellings, by an extended closing sequence focused entirely on the sufferer's restoration, blessings for renewed health, renewed standing in their household and community, renewed capacity to return to ordinary daily life. The ritual wasn't considered complete at the moment of destruction. It was considered complete only once the sufferer had been symbolically, formally welcomed back into the fabric of ordinary living, which tells you something about what this whole system understood itself to actually be for. Not exorcism as an end in itself. Restoration, with the naming and the burning as the means to get there. There's a detail in the Shurpu tradition, specifically, that I think deserves its own moment, because it's genuinely moving once you sit with it. A substantial portion of the Shurpu series is structured as an extended, almost exhaustive list of possible causes of affliction: offenses against gods, broken oaths, family conflict, unresolved guilt, simple bad luck, recited one after another, with the sufferer symbolically released from each in turn, specifically so that no single true cause needed to be identified with certainty for the ritual to work. If the priest didn't know precisely which of 100 possible causes was responsible, the ritual didn't fail. It simply worked through the entire list, releasing the sufferer from all of them, covering every base rather than requiring a single, perfectly accurate diagnosis before treatment could begin. I find that detail remarkable, honestly, because it's a genuinely humble piece of ancient methodology, an acknowledgement, built directly into the ritual structure itself, that a healer might not always know exactly what's wrong, and that treatment shouldn't have to wait on certainty it might never get. That's not a bad instinct to borrow, even now. The idea that support doesn't require a fully diagnosed, fully named cause to be worth offering, and that a person struggling doesn't need to have the right label attached to their struggle before someone is willing to help them carry it. Chapter 13. The Pattern. Let's bring the mystery thread all the way back now, because we've spent 2 hours in the content of K-Taunt 9204, and it's time to sit honestly with the frame around it. Here's what we actually know, stated as plainly as I can manage. A translator working at the British Museum in the 1890s, self-taught, working outside the field's usual institutional channels, apparently encountered a fragment matching this description, translated 8 of its 9 sections in detail, previewed all 9 headers in a single early pass, and left the 9th section untranslated in his own surviving papers, accompanied by a single, personal, unexplained marginal note next to the 4th section, the sleep paralysis section, reading, "I have this one. I did not know I had it until I read it." We also know, and this part is genuinely, unglamorously true of the field as a whole, not specific to this one fragment, that the physical process of cataloguing the Nineveh library has been ongoing for over a century and a half and remains incomplete. Fragments have been misfiled, mislabeled, separated from their original context, damaged in storage, lost in transit between institutions during 2 world wars, and in some documented cases, simply never assigned proper individual catalogue numbers at all, sitting in trays under broad, unhelpful groupings for decades before anyone gets to them individually. This is not a conspiracy. This is what chronic under-resourcing and the sheer, overwhelming scale of a 30,000 fragment archive actually looks like, and it's a well-documented, acknowledged reality within the field itself. So when we say that K 9204 doesn't currently appear under a clean, findable catalogue entry in the museum's public records, and it doesn't, as of this recording, the honest, responsible thing to say is that this is, on its own, extremely weak evidence of anything unusual. It's exactly what you'd expect from an under-catalogued fragment in an archive this size, handled by an outsider scholar working before modern archival standards existed, whose personal papers were scattered and only partially recovered decades after his death. Ordinary archival loss, well documented as a common outcome in exactly this kind of situation, is a completely sufficient explanation on its own, without needing anything more dramatic layered on top of it. I want to say that clearly, because I think it's the honest position, and because I promised you at the start of this video that we'd hold the mystery and the explanation side by side, rather than picking one and pretending the other doesn't exist. And yet, here's the piece that keeps this chapter interesting rather than closing it down entirely: the specific, personal detail of the marginal note. Ordinary archival loss explains a missing catalogue entry. It explains gaps in institutional records. It's a much less complete explanation for why one specific man, translating 8 sections of a text in careful, methodical detail, would stop cold at the 9th, and would leave, next to an entirely different section, a note that reads less like a scholar's professional annotation and more like a private, unguarded moment of personal recognition. I have this one. I did not know I had it until I read it. The kind of sentence a person writes when something in a text has stopped being academic and started being about them. Maybe that's exactly what it was. A man reading a description of sleep paralysis, recognizing his own experience in it. An experience that, as we now know, is genuinely common and genuinely universal, and writing down an honest human reaction in the margin of his own working notes, the same way any of us might scribble something in the margin of a book that happen to describe us a little too precisely. That's a complete, sufficient, entirely mundane explanation, and it's very likely the true one. Maybe it's something else. I don't know, and I'm not going to pretend I do, and I'd be suspicious of anyone in this genre who claims certainty either way from where we're sitting, with the evidence we actually have. What I'll say honestly is this. I don't think the interesting question here is really, was the tablet real? Was the theft real? Was Halloran hiding something? I think the interesting question, the one this whole 3 hours has actually been circling, is why a description written 5,000 years ago, in a completely different cosmology, with zero access to modern psychology or neuroscience, manages to land with this much precision on experiences that remain, even now, genuinely strange to live through, even after we've fully explained them. Let's also be fair to the other side of this, because a responsible telling of a suppression narrative has to actually engage with the boring, structural explanations, rather than just naming them once and moving past them. The British Museum's cuneiform collection has been through 2 world wars. During the Second World War specifically, significant portions of the museum's holdings, not just cuneiform tablets, but huge swathes of the collection, were evacuated to underground storage outside London for safekeeping, and the process of returning, resorting, and recataloguing everything afterward took years, introduced known gaps and misfilings that conservators are still occasionally discovering and correcting today, and happened, notably, well after Halloran's own working period, meaning any personal papers or working notes he left behind would have had their own, entirely separate chances to be scattered, lost, or misfiled during exactly this kind of large-scale institutional upheaval. On top of that, the field's cataloging standards themselves have changed substantially over the past century. Early registration numbers, assigned quickly during the initial 19th century processing of the excavated material, were sometimes reused, sometimes assigned to groups of fragments rather than individual pieces, and sometimes recorded in ledgers that have themselves since been damaged or partially lost. A fragment cited by an outsider scholar working from an early informal reference, exactly the position Halloran was in, could easily fail to map cleanly onto the museum's current, modernized digital catalogue, not because the fragment doesn't exist, but because the bridge between the old informal reference and the new formal one was simply never built, or was built and then lost in one of these institutional disruptions. I want to give all of that its full weight, because I think it's actually the most likely explanation, and because I'd rather you leave this video appropriately skeptical than appropriately spooked. Ordinary institutional chaos, compounded across more than a century, 2 wars, and multiple generations of changing archival practice, is fully sufficient to explain everything we've described about this fragment's uncertain status, without needing anything stranger sitting underneath it. There's one more angle worth considering before we close this chapter, and it's the one I find genuinely hardest to dismiss, even while holding on to everything I just said about ordinary archival chaos. Suppression narratives are common in this genre for a reason. They're satisfying, they give a mystery a villain, they turn a gap in the record into a story rather than just an absence. I want to be honest that I'm aware of that pull, and aware that it's tempting to lean into it here, because a missing 9th section and an unexplained personal note make for a genuinely compelling hour of television, and I'd be lying if I said that wasn't part of why we're spending time on it. But here's the more measured version of the same observation, stripped of the temptation to oversell it. It's not that Halloran was hiding something from us. If anything happened here beyond ordinary archival loss, the more plausible, more human reading is that he was working something out for himself, reading a text that, symptom by symptom, was describing his own inner life back to him with uncomfortable precision, and simply running out of the professional distance needed to finish the job once the text arrived at the one section closest to whatever he was actually carrying. That's not a conspiracy. That's just what happens, sometimes, when the material you're translating stops being safely ancient and starts being uncomfortably present. And one more thing, before we close this chapter out, because it matters more than the mystery does, none of this, the missing catalogue entry, the blank 9th section, the strange marginal note, is a reason to distrust an actual diagnosis, an actual doctor, an actual therapist, if any part of the last 2 hours described something real happening in your own life. If anything, and I mean this as the actual conclusion of this chapter, not just a disclaimer bolted onto the end of it, the Ashipu himself, the fictional and the historically real version both, would be the first person to tell you to go get one. Chapter 14. What you do with it. If you're still here, 3 hours in, I want to talk to you directly for a minute, because I think you've earned that, and because I think the reason you stayed says something worth naming. You didn't stay because you believe a piece of your soul can literally be taken by a demon named in a 5,000-year-old text. I don't think most people watching this believe that, and I don't believe it either. I think you stayed because, somewhere in the middle of these 9 chapters, you recognize something. Your own hands, for a second, not quite yours, your own name, arriving a beat late, a face you weren't sure you meant, a wait in the dark you've never told anyone about, a drive you don't remember taking, a room that felt wrong for no reason you could name, a meal that tasted like nothing, a voice that said your name in an empty house, a reflection that took a half-second too long to catch up to you. Somewhere in that list, something landed. That's not a coincidence, and it's not evidence of anything supernatural. It's evidence that being a person is stranger, more fragile, and more universally shared than most of us walk around acknowledging on an ordinary day. Every single one of the 9 things on this list is something enormous numbers of other people have also felt, often without ever saying so out loud, because there's rarely a comfortable moment to bring it up. My hands didn't feel like mine for a second isn't really a sentence most people have anywhere to put. So here's my actual invitation. Now that the myth has done its work of getting you to sit still for 3 hours and pay attention, notice these 9 experiences in your own life going forward, if they show up, without pathologizing them and without mystifying them either. Most of what's on this list, most of the time, is just what it feels like to be a tired, stressed, grieving, ordinary human brain running its ordinary automatic processes under less than ideal conditions. It doesn't need a demon to explain it, and it doesn't need you to worry about it either, most of the time. It just needs you to notice it, maybe name it, and let it pass, the way it almost always does. Think back, for a second, to Chapter 1, the 2 practitioners, working side by side, neither one considered sufficient on its own. I keep coming back to that detail because I think it's the real takeaway of this entire 3 hours, more than any single symptom, more than the mystery of the missing 9th section. A culture we tend to file away as purely mythic, purely superstitious, had somehow already worked out something a lot of us are still, individually, slow to accept about ourselves. That a person can be genuinely, physically fine and still be struggling. That struggling doesn't require a visible wound to be legitimate, and that the right response to an invisible affliction isn't to pick a single lens and declare it sufficient, but to bring more than one kind of attention to it, at the same time, without treating that as a contradiction. You don't need to believe in the Lilu or the Galu or a tablet's missing 9th section to take that structure seriously. You just need to be willing to name what's actually happening to you, plainly, without dressing it up as a haunting and without dismissing it as nothing. And then let more than one kind of care reach it. A friend you tell the truth to. A professional whose whole job is exactly this. Rest. When rest is the thing that's actually missing. All of it. Together. The way the Asu and the Ashipu work together. Because neither one, alone, was ever meant to be the whole answer. But, and I want to close on this directly one more time, because it's the single thing in 3 hours I'd actually want you to act on, rather than just feel unsettled by. If any of this, especially the 7th chapter, especially that hollow, ash-in-the-mouth loss of pleasure in things that used to matter to you, sounded less like an occasional strange moment and more like where you've actually been living for a while now, please talk to someone, a doctor, a therapist, a person you trust enough to say the real sentence to. Not because there's a demon to name and burn away in a ritual, there isn't, but because there's real, effective help available for exactly this, and going without it for longer than you need to is the only genuinely sad ending buried anywhere in this story. The Ashipu, if he existed, if this tablet is anything like what it claims to be, would have told you the same thing, in his own language, 5,000 years ago. Go see the other doctor too. He never thought his half of the story was the whole story. Neither should this video. There are more tablets. There's a companion series to the one we spent this video with, later fragments, other catalogued numbers, other names half recovered from other estate sales, and other forgotten margins, and we are not done with them. I'll leave you with the same thing I opened this video with, because I think it's the only claim in 3 hours I'd actually stand behind without a single hedge attached to it, whatever K-Born 9204 turns out to be, wherever it actually sits in a storage tray somewhere in London right now, or doesn't. The 9 things it describes are real, not real in the sense of demons and stolen breath, real in the sense that they happen to ordinary people all the time, and that naming them plainly, out loud, without either dismissing them or dressing them up as something supernatural, is worth doing. That's the whole trick this video has been trying to pull off for 3 hours, and I hope, if nothing else about the mystery landed for you, that piece did. If you made it all the way here, thank you for sitting with this one for as long as it asked you to. Subscribe if you want to be there for the next tablet, and take care of yourself between now and then. The real kind of care, not the mythic kind.